The rain came down in a fury that promised to drown the world. It fell not as drops, but as a solid, driving sheet of water that turned the trail to a river of mud and hammered against Elias Rourke's oilskin coat with the rhythm of 100 tiny fists. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, lowered its head and pushed onward, its trust in the man on its back the only thing keeping it from turning tail against the onslaught. Elias squinted into the gray gloom, his hat pulled low. The wind howled a lonesome tune through the pines, a sound he knew as well as his own breathing. It was a language of solitude, one he had come to understand in the years since he had traded the gun for the branding iron. His ranch was a small, lonely patch carved out of the unforgiving landscape, nestled in the foothills where the mountains began their climb toward the heavens. It was a place of quiet, a penance of his own making. The 2-room cabin and the sturdy barn were all the company he needed, the cattle his silent congregation. He lived by a simple code now: mind his own, harm none, and forget the man he used to be. The world could tear itself apart in the towns and saloons, but out here, there was only the changing of the seasons and the hard, honest work that left a man too tired to dream. He was almost home. He could see the dark shape of the barn through the deluge, a welcome silhouette against the bruised sky. It was then that Gideon shied, letting out a nervous snort and planting its hoofs deep in the muck. Elias pulled gently on the reins, his eyes scanning the ground. Easy, boy. Just the storm. But it was not just the storm. Lying in a heap near the barn door was a splash of white against the brown earth, a thing that did not belong. At first, he thought it was a dead calf, or perhaps a deer struck by lightning. He swung himself down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the mud. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. She was collapsed on her side, half submerged in a growing puddle. Her dress, once an elegant thing of white lace and fine cotton, was torn and smeared with mud, and something darker that the rain could not wash away. One of her arms was thrown out, her hand pale and still. Elias knelt, his heart a sudden, heavy drum against his ribs. He turned her over gently. Her face was a mess of bruises, her lips blue with cold. A long, ugly gash ran along her temple, her blonde hair matted with blood. She was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, shuddering gasps. She was a ghost thrown up by the storm, a piece of the violent world he had tried so hard to leave behind. For a long moment, he was frozen. The law, what little there was of it out here, dictated he ride to town, to Blackwater Creek, and fetch Sheriff Brody. But the town was 10 miles of treacherous trail away, and he knew in his gut this woman did not have that long. The cold was already deep in her bones. He looked at her torn dress, the marks on her skin that even the mud could not hide. This was not the work of a fall from a horse. This was the work of a man. A cold, familiar anger stirred in him, an old ghost he fought to keep buried. He made his decision. Scooping her into his arms, he was surprised by how little she weighed. She was a fragile thing, all bone and cold flesh. She moaned softly, a sound so faint it was nearly lost in the wind. He carried her toward the cabin, the rain plastering her wet hair to his cheek. Gideon followed, nudged the cabin door open with his head, and stood patiently as Elias carried his strange burden inside. He laid her down on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire cabin. The room was sparse and clean, smelling of pine smoke, leather, and coffee. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers glowing faintly. He stripped off his wet coat and set about building up the fire, his movements quick and sure. Soon, flames were licking at the dry kindling, casting a warm, flickering light across the rough-hewn walls. He lit a lantern and placed it on the small table near the bed, its steady glow pushing back the shadows. He worked on her then, with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who knew his past. He fetched a bucket of clean water and a rag. He carefully washed the blood and mud from her face, his touch as light as he could make it. Her skin was like ice. The bruises on her face were dark and ugly, blossoming across her cheekbone and along her jaw. Her dress was ruined, ripped at the shoulder and along the hem. He could not bring himself to remove it, but he unlaced her soaked boots and pulled them from her feet, chafing her frozen toes between his rough palms. He covered her with every blanket he owned, piling them high until she was just a small mound in the center of his bed. He sat in the single wooden chair he possessed, watching her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing as the storm raged on outside. He was a man who had sworn off trouble, yet here it was, lying half dead in his bed. Hours passed. The storm quieted to a steady, drumming rain. The fire crackled. Elias did not sleep. He watched the woman, his mind a turmoil of questions. Who was she? What had happened to her? And what in God's name was he going to do with her? It was near dawn when she woke. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, flew open, wide with terror. She tried to sit up, a strangled cry catching in her throat as she took in the unfamiliar room. The strange man sitting in the chair. She scrambled backward on the cot, pulling the blankets up to her chin like a shield, her body trembling violently. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and calm. He did not move from his chair, did not want to spook her further. He held his hands up, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here. I found you outside, in the storm." She stared at him, her breathing ragged. She was like a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee. The fear in her eyes was a raw, palpable thing. He had seen fear like that before, in the eyes of men he had faced down in dusty streets. He had never seen it in a woman, and it twisted something inside him. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. "Name's Elias Rourke. This is my place." He kept his voice even, a low rumble that was meant to soothe. "You were near frozen. I brought you in to get warm." She glanced around the cabin again, her gaze darting from the rifle mounted over the fireplace to the bolted door. Her eyes were searching for an escape. He could see the struggle on her face, the war between exhaustion and a desperate need to run. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "You have my word on that." Something in his tone, some note of weary sincerity, seemed to reach her. The rigid terror in her shoulders eased. Just a fraction. She licked her chapped lips. "My name, it's Annabeth. Annabeth Hale." "Annabeth," he repeated. The name felt strange in the stark simplicity of his cabin. It was a name for parlors and church socials, not for a place like this. I can't go back," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, you can't make me go back." She did not say where back was, or what she was running from. The sheer panic in her voice was explanation enough. Elias felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. His duty was clear. He should take her to town. The sheriff could sort this out. That was the proper thing to do. But he looked at her bruised face, the way she flinched when he shifted in his chair, and he knew he could not do it. Taking her to town felt like leading a lamb back to the slaughter. "I ain't gonna make you do anything," he said, the words feeling heavy in the quiet room. "You can stay the night. Rest up. We'll figure the rest out when the sun's up." She searched his face, looking for a trick, a lie. She found none. The exhaustion finally won its battle, and she sagged back against the pillows, her eyes fluttering shut. She did not fall into a deep sleep, but a light, troubled doze, her brow furrowed, her hands still clenched tight around the blankets. Elias let out a long breath he did not realize he had been holding. He had made a promise, and he knew, with a sinking certainty, that this one night was going to become far more complicated. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun was trying to break through the clouds. Elias was outside, tending to Gideon. When he heard the sound of approaching riders, he straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he had been using to chop wood. Two figures emerged from the tree line, making their way up the muddy track to his cabin. One was a large, broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Brody. The other was a thin, severe-looking man in a black coat and collar. Reverend Miller. Elias's blood ran cold. He leaned the axe against the woodpile and walked to the front of the cabin, planting himself in front of the door. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. "Rourke," Sheriff Brody said by way of greeting, reining in his horse. His eyes, small and hard, swept over the cabin, the barn, the whole sorry excuse for a ranch. "Seen you ain't been to town in a while." "Been busy," Elias replied, his voice flat. Reverend Miller cleared his throat, his face a mask of pious concern. "A terrible thing has happened. Elias, a tragedy at the house of the Lord." "Is that so?" Elias said, his gaze fixed on the sheriff. Brody swung himself down from his horse, his boots making a sucking sound in the mud. He hitched his gun belt. "My bride, Annabeth Hale, ran off yesterday, right from the church." His voice was tight with a proprietary anger. "There was a fire. She caused a disturbance, then vanished into the storm. We're looking for her." Elias felt a prickle of sweat on his neck. Despite the morning chill, he could feel her presence inside the cabin, could almost hear the frantic beating of her heart. He thought of her bruised face and her terrified plea. "Why would you be looking for her out here?" Elias asked, making his voice sound tired, disinterested. "This is the last place a woman would run to." "We're checking everywhere," Brody said, his eyes narrowing. "She's a confused, hysterical woman. No telling what she might do or where she might go. She was set to be my wife." Behind the sheriff, Elias could see Annabeth's face in a small crack in the cabin's curtains, her eyes wide with fear. He held his ground. "Well, I ain't seen anyone," he said, the lie coming out easier than he expected. He had lied many times in his life, usually to save his own skin. This was the first time he had lied to save someone else's. It felt different, heavier. "Just me and my cattle, and the rain." Brody stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment, as if trying to see through him, to peel back the lie and find the truth hiding underneath. Elias met his gaze without flinching. He was a man who knew the sound of a lie because he had told so many, and he knew the look of a man who believed one. "Finally." The sheriff grunted, seemingly satisfied. "Well, if you do see her, you send word to me immediately. She's not well in the head. Might be dangerous." "I'll do that." "Sheriff," Elias lied again. Reverend Miller offered a final, parting piece of scripture about the wickedness of the flesh, his eyes lingering on Elias's cabin with a look of deep suspicion. Then they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than the storm. Elias waited until they were gone from sight before he turned and went back inside. Annabeth was standing in the middle of the room, her whole body shaking. As the cabin door closed behind him, a memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced through her fear. She saw the sheriff's face, not as a lawman, but as the man her father had been indebted to. She saw her father's signature on a piece of paper, his hand trembling. The land, the cattle, their entire life, signed away to settle a debt. And then the sheriff's cold offer. The debt would be forgiven. The land returned, in exchange for her hand. Her father, a broken man, had agreed. Her marriage was not a union. It was the final payment on a loan. Elias saw the haunted look in her eyes. "They're gone," he said quietly. She did not seem to hear him. She was somewhere else, trapped in a memory. He said nothing more, just went about his morning chores, making coffee, stoking the fire. He was acutely aware of her, of the fragile truce that existed between them. He noticed how a log shifting in the fire made her jump, how she flinched away when he walked past her to get the coffee pot. She seemed to hold herself in, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. She was a ghost in his house, and he did not know how to speak to her. Later that day, he took some old planks and rope from the barn and built a small cot for her in the corner of the cabin, opposite his own. He wanted to give her a space that was hers, a place where she might feel some small measure of safety. She watched him work, her expression unreadable. When he was done, he placed one of his blankets on it. "It ain't much," he said, not looking at her, "but it's better than the floor." She whispered a thank you, her voice barely audible. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Annabeth, it turned out, was not one to be idle. She started to help, cautiously at first. She swept the floor, washed the few dishes he owned, mended a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread she found in a small sewing kit he had forgotten he possessed. He never asked her to do these things, and he made it clear she was not his servant, but he understood her need to feel useful, to earn her keep, to impose some order on the chaos of her life. They rarely spoke, but a quiet understanding began to grow in the space between them. He would leave a portion of his meal for her on the table, and when he returned, the plate would be clean. He would find his worn-out shirt neatly folded, the tear stitched with a precision that spoke of a different life. About a week after she arrived, he ran low on flour and salt. He had to go to town. He hated the idea of leaving her alone, but it could not be helped. He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, and propped it by the door. "Bolt the door behind me," he told her. "Don't open it for anyone, not for any reason." She nodded, her eyes wide. Blackwater Creek had not changed. It was a town built on judgment and gossip. As Elias walked into the general store, the conversations quieted. He felt the weight of their stares. He was an outcast, a man the town tolerated but did not trust. He gathered his supplies, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him down the aisles, but he could not block them out entirely. The story of the runaway bride was on everyone's lips, and it had grown more twisted with each telling. "Heard she was carrying on with the preacher's son," one woman hissed to another over a barrel of pickles. "Sheriff Brody is a saint to have put up with her," another added. "She was a tease, that one, always smiling at men she shouldn't." The store owner, a portly man named Henderson, leaned over the counter as he weighed the flour. "They say she lit the church fire herself," he said in a low, conspiratorial voice. "Tried to burn the whole place down with the sheriff inside. A wicked, wicked girl." Elias paid for his goods, his face a stony mask. He did not know what to believe. The Annabeth he was getting to know, the quiet, frightened woman who flinched at shadows, did not seem like the seductress and arsonist the town described. But he had been fooled before. He had learned the hard way that a pretty face could hide a dark heart. The doubt was a bitter taste in his mouth as he rode home. He found her outside, standing in the light drizzle that had started to fall. The world was gray and weeping again. She was holding a piece of white lace in her hands, turning it over and over. He recognized it as a piece of a wedding veil. It was singed at the edges, blackened by fire. She was crying, not loudly, but with silent, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. He dismounted and walked toward her. She did not seem to notice him until he was standing right beside her. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and rain. For the first time, he let his eyes drift down, past her face, to her dress. The fine cotton was scorched along one side, the heat having melted the delicate fabric, leaving it puckered and brown, and through a tear near her shoulder, he could see the angry red mark of a burn on her skin. The whispers of the town died in his head. The rumors, the lies, the judgment, they all turned to smoke and blew away on the damp wind. He did not know her story, not all of it, but he knew pain when he saw it. He knew what it looked like when the world tried to burn a soul to the ground. Without a word, he took off his heavy wool coat, the one that smelled of horse and rain and him, and draped it over her shoulders. It was far too big for her, swallowing her small frame, but it was warm. It was a shield. She looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with a bottomless ocean of sorrow, and for the first time since she had arrived, She did not flinch from his presence. The rain kept falling, washing over the two of them. A man with a broken vow and a woman with a broken future, standing together in the ruins. The coat he had given her became a permanent fixture. She wore it inside the cabin, a shield of dark wool against a world that had offered her nothing but cold. In the days that followed, Annabeth moved with a quiet, determined purpose, as if work was the only prayer she had left. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards were pale. She learned the quirks of his old wood stove and managed to bake bread that filled the small cabin with a scent of home Elias had not known in years. She insisted on washing his clothes, her hands turning red in the lye soap and cold water. Elias watched her, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He had offered her shelter, not servitude. One evening, he came in from checking the fences to find her on her knees, mending a hem on one of her tattered petticoats by the dim light of the fire. A plate with his dinner, a thick slice of venison and the last of the bread, was waiting on the table. "You don't have to do all this," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up, startled, a needle poised in her hand. "I have to earn my keep. Elias, I will not be a burden." He walked over and took the plate from the table, then sat down in his chair, but did not eat. "You are not a burden, and this ain't a debt to be paid. You're here because you needed a safe place. That's all." She looked down at the fabric in her lap. "It is not a safe place for you," she said softly. "You lied to the sheriff for me. You risk yourself every day I am here." "I'll be the judge of my own risks," he said gruffly. But her words were true. He was a man living on a wire, and she was the storm blowing in from the west. The silence between them began to fill with words. They came slowly at first, in fragments offered up in the quiet evenings after the chores were done. He would sit sharpening a knife. She would sit patching a shirt, and the stories would emerge from the shadows. She told him about her father, a good man broken by drought and debt. She spoke of her brother, Thomas, a wild but gentle boy who had been her only friend. One night, as the wind rattled the single window pane, she finally told him the rest. "It was Thomas," she began, her voice a near whisper. "Sheriff Brody said he was caught rustling cattle from his herd. There was no trial. Brody and his deputy, they said he tried to run." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap until her knuckles were white. "They shot him in the back. I saw them. From the woods. I saw them drag him back and make it look like something else." Elias stopped his work, the whetstone silent in his hand. He looked at her, at the raw pain etched on her face. "Brody came to my father the next day," she continued, her voice trembling. "He said he knew we were destitute. He said he would forget the debt, that he would see to it we were cared for. All he asked for was my hand in marriage. It was not a proposal. It was a threat. My father saw no other way. He was already a ghost by then." The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. "The wedding day. I couldn't do it. I could not stand there in God's house and pledge myself to the man who murdered my brother. When the preacher asked if anyone had cause to object, I spoke. I told them all what he did. I called him a killer." She took a shaky breath. "No one believed me. They looked at me as if I was mad." Brody just smiled, that cold smile of his. He told them I was overwrought, that my grief had turned my mind. The preacher tried to take my arm, to quiet me. Brody tried to pull me from the altar. I fought back. I knocked over a candelabra. The draperies, they went up in flames so fast. There was screaming, smoke. Everyone ran in the chaos. I ran too. I just ran. Elias stared into the fire, the orange light flickering in his dark eyes. He saw it all, the panicked crowd, the sanctimonious preacher, the smug sheriff, and her, a lone voice of truth that no one would hear. "They turned on you," he said. It was not a question. "They called me a liar, a devil, the sheriff's bride who tried to burn him alive." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He would have killed me, Elias. If not that day, then soon." A wife's death is an easier thing to explain than a troublesome girl's. He felt the old anger, the one he kept locked away, rattle its cage. He wanted to ride into Blackwater Creek and see the town burn for what it had done to her. Instead, he took the story she had given him and held it, a fragile, broken thing. He owed her a truth of his own. "I killed a man once," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "in a saloon in Kansas. He was a card cheat and a bully, but that don't make it right. He drew on me. I was faster." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from ranch work, but he could still feel the weight of the Colt he used to carry. I saw his eyes after, the surprise, the life just draining out of him. I saw his wife at the funeral. The way she looked at me, I swore that day I'd never kill again, no matter what. I came out here to be away from it all, to be a man who fixes fences, not one who breaks lives. She listened, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw him not just as a protector, but as a man with ghosts of his own. They were two broken people, sitting by a fire, surrounded by a wilderness that did not care about their sins. The sky broke open again a few nights later. Thunder rolled across the mountains, a deep, guttural roar that shook the little cabin to its foundations. With the first clap, Annabeth cried out. She scrambled from her cot and huddled under the small wooden table, her hands over her ears, her body shaking uncontrollably. "The fire," she whispered, her voice choked with terror. "The screams! I can hear the screams!" Elias was by her side in an instant, kneeling on the floor beside the table. He did not touch her. He just spoke, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her memory. "It's just thunder. Annabeth, you're not there. You're here. You're safe." He stayed there all night, talking to her in quiet tones, telling her about his horse, about the stubborn calf he'd had to pull from the mud last spring, about anything and everything that was solid and real and present. He did not sleep. He just watched over her as the storm of her past raged, waiting for it to break. By dawn, the thunder had moved on, and she had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the floor, her cheek resting on his knee. He gently lifted her and carried her to her cot, tucking the blanket around her. He looked down at her face, peaceful in sleep, and felt a powerful, aching tenderness that frightened him more than any gunfight ever had. That night, he dreamed of her. He dreamed of her hair, not matted with blood, but shining like spun gold in the sun. He dreamed of her smile, a thing he had not yet seen. He dreamed of pulling her close, of feeling the warmth of her body against his, of kissing the scars he knew were hidden beneath her scorched dress. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He hated himself for it. She was a wounded bird he had taken in, not a woman to be coveted. To desire her was a betrayal of the trust she had placed in him. It made him no better than Brody, who saw her as a thing to be owned. The outside world would not leave them to their fragile peace. A week later, he saw fresh tracks down by the river, not far from the cabin. A rider heading back toward town. He knew, with a cold certainty, what it meant. Someone had seen something. Brody would be back. "We have to go," he told her, his voice grim. He packed a bedroll, a canteen, and what little food they had into a saddlebag. "We'll head up into the hills, lay low for a few days until they give up the search." She did not question him. She simply put on his coat, her face pale but her resolve firm. He boosted her onto Gideon's back, then swung up behind her. It was the first time they had been so close. Her back was pressed against his chest, and he could feel the slightness of her frame, the warmth of her through the thick wool of his coat. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the trail ahead, but the scent of her hair, clean and fresh from the rainwater she used to wash it, filled his senses. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the rugged country where the pines grew thick and the ground was unforgiving. He found a small overhang of rock, a shallow cave that would offer some protection from the elements. As if on cue, the sky opened up, and a cold, Hard rain began to fall. They were trapped. He built a small, smokeless fire just inside the mouth of the cave. The space was cramped. They sat side by side, sharing a blanket, listening to the rain drum against the stone. The world was reduced to this small circle of warmth, this tiny pocket of existence carved out of the storm. Later, she stood up, needing to stretch her legs. She walked to the edge of the shelter, looking out into the gray deluge. The ground was slick with wet leaves and mud. Her foot slipped. She cried out as she fell backward, and he lunged, catching her just before she hit the ground. His arm was wrapped tight around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Her hands came up to brace against his chest. Their faces were inches apart. He could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes, could feel her warm breath on his cheek. The world seemed to stop. The sound of the rain faded to a dull roar. He saw the fear in her eyes, but something else too, something new. She did not pull away. He held her there for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, slowly, he helped her back to her feet, his hands lingering on her arms before he let go, putting a careful distance between them once more. That night, sleeping on opposite sides of the small fire, the tension was a living thing in the cave.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice soft in the darkness.
"Why haven't you tried anything?"
The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. He knew what she was asking. She was asking why he had not treated her like a man was expected to treat a woman he had alone in the wilderness. She was asking why he had not taken what he could. He stared into the flames, the words catching in his throat. "Because if I were to touch you when you're like this," he said, his voice low and strained, scared and with nowhere else to go, "I'd be no better than the men who hurt you. I'd just be another man using you for his own needs." He heard her shift on her bedroll. He expected silence, or maybe tears. He did not expect her next words. "Break your promise," she whispered into the darkness, a desperate, aching plea. "Then take me." The word struck him like a physical blow. He shot to his feet, his breath catching in his chest. He could not look at her. He could not speak. He turned and walked out of the shelter, into the pouring rain. The cold water soaked him in seconds, but he barely felt it. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his face turned up to the angry sky, letting the storm wash over him, trying to douse the fire she had lit inside him. They returned to the cabin 2 days later, the immediate threat having passed. But the truce between them was broken. The air was thick with unspoken things. He chopped firewood with a reckless energy, trying to sweat out his turmoil. Annabeth watched him from the cabin window, her expression a mixture of longing and despair. He came inside later that afternoon, his shirt soaked with sweat and rain. He peeled it off, tossing it over the back of a chair, and turned his back to her, reaching for a rag to wipe down. He was examining a fresh splinter in his shoulder when he felt a touch, light as a moth's wing, on his bare skin. He flinched as if he had been burned, jerking away from her. He turned to face her. She stood there, her hand still outstretched, her eyes full of a raw, desperate need to be seen, to be touched, to be wanted. Her longing was a palpable force in the small room, a thing more powerful than shame or fear. And in that moment, his resolve shattered. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his hands coming up to cup her face. He looked down at her parted lips, at the storm in her eyes, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, filled with all the loneliness and longing and fear they had both kept locked away. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke and salvation. For a breathtaking instant, he let himself fall, let himself believe that this was right, that two broken people could find a way to be whole in each other's arms. Then his promise, his vow, came crashing back down on him. He remembered the dead man's eyes. He remembered her terror. He was her protector, not another man to take what he wanted from her. He broke the kiss, pulling back as if the touch of her lips had scalded him. He stumbled away from her, putting the table between them, his chest heaving. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips. It was a sound of such profound heartbreak that it tore through him. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. He went to her, but he did not pull her into his arms as a lover would. He wrapped his arms around her and held her, his body a shield, his embrace a promise of safety, not passion. He held her as she cried, offering the only thing he believed he had a right to give, his protection. That night, as Annabeth slept the fitful sleep of the grieving, Elias sat in his chair, the fire burning low, outside, in the deep woods. A wolf howled, a long, lonely cry that was answered by another, and then another. The pack was gathering. He listened, his face grim. The sound was a perfect echo of the feeling in his gut. The danger was not gone. It was just circling, waiting. He reached for the old rifle mounted on the wall, took it down, and began to clean and oil it with slow, deliberate movements. He took a whetstone and sharpened the blade of his hunting knife until it had a razor's edge. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that someone was coming. And he knew, with a heart full of dread, that he might not be able to keep his promise for much longer. The decision was made in the quiet of the pre-dawn hours. Without words, Elias looked at the rifle he had cleaned, then at Annabeth, who was watching him with wide, knowing eyes. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage, and the hunters were closing in. He had spent years building a life of solitude, a penance paid in sweat and silence. Now, he would tear it down for the woman who had washed up in his storm. "Pack what you can carry," he said, his voice a low rumble in the stillness.
We're leaving.
She did not ask where. She simply nodded and turned to the small corner that had become hers. There was little to take. A change of clothes he had given her, a small comb, the mended petticoat. Her fingers brushed against the singed lace of her wedding veil, which she had kept tucked away like a sacred wound. She hesitated, then left it on the cot. She would carry the memory of the fire, but she would not carry its tokens. As she folded a worn dress, the memory she fought to keep buried rose with the force of a flood. She was standing in her father's study, a room that always smelled of old paper and quiet despair. Sheriff Brody was there, his bulk filling the doorway, blocking out the light. He was not wearing a star. He did not need it. His power was a palpable thing in the small room. "Your father has made his decision, Annabeth," Brody said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. He looked not at her, but at her father, a man so stooped by debt and grief he seemed to be shrinking into his own chair. "The land will remain yours, the debts forgiven. All it requires is your cooperation." "It requires my life," she had said, her own voice shaking with a rage that felt foreign and frightening. Brody's gaze finally settled on her, and his eyes were devoid of warmth. "A small price. You will be a sheriff's wife, a respected woman. You should be grateful." He took a step closer, and she could smell the faint scent of whiskey and leather on him. "Your father understands the value of this arrangement. A man must protect his property." He gestured around the room, at the worn books and faded maps. It was clear he was not just talking about the land. Her father would not meet her eyes. She saw the tremor in his hands, the utter defeat in the slump of his shoulders. A week later, he was dead. The doctor called it a failure of the heart. Annabeth knew it was a failure of the will. His death sealed the bargain. She was now just another piece of property to be transferred, the final payment on a debt of a dead man. She blinked, the memory receding, leaving the bitter taste of ash in her mouth. She looked at Elias, who was strapping a bedroll and a saddlebag with supplies. He was not a man of property. He was a man of promises, even the ones he had broken. He was her only hope. They left as the sun was casting its first pale light over the mountains, leaving the cabin door unlatched an empty shell that had for a short time been a home. Elias put her on Gideon's back and then swung up behind her, taking the reins. They did not look back. The trail led up into the high country, a rugged and unforgiving wilderness of rock and pine. The mountains loomed before them, a jagged wall between the life they were fleeing and a future they could not imagine. For 2 days, they traveled, speaking little, conserving their energy. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. On the third night, the sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned a bruised purple. A storm was coming, a fierce mountain squall with a wind that carried the bite of ice. Elias found them shelter in a deep crevice between 2 massive boulders. A small, natural cave, barely big enough for the 2 of them, and the horse tethered just outside. He built a fire, but it was small, offering a pathetic circle of warmth against a cold that seeped from the very rock around them. The wind howled through the pass, a symphony of desolation. They huddled together under their shared blankets, but the cold was relentless. Annabeth was shivering, her teeth chattering despite the wool coat and the blankets. Elias could feel the tremors running through her body where she was pressed against his side. He knew what he had to do. The heat of a fire was not enough. They needed the heat of each other. He pulled the blankets tighter, shifting so that he was half enclosing her, his body a windbreak. Still, she shivered. In the deep dark of the cave, with the storm raging outside, she turned toward him. It was a small movement, tentative, almost questioning. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his chest. He froze. It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was a simple, human need for warmth, for comfort, for the touch of another living soul in the vast, cold darkness. And this time, he did not pull away. He let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like a lifetime, a breath full of guilt and longing and loneliness. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her fully against him until her head was tucked beneath his chin. She was so small, so fragile in his arms, but she was warm. She sighed, a soft sound of surrender, and the shivering subsided. He held her through the night, his promise of distance forgotten, his vow of solitude broken by the simple, undeniable need to hold and be held. The morning broke clear and cold. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean. A layer of frost covered the rocks, glittering in the early sun. Annabeth woke first, still wrapped in his arms. She did not move, content for a moment to listen to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. When he stirred, she pulled back slightly, a blush rising on her cheeks. The air between them was different now. The tension had not vanished, but it had changed, softened into a kind of shy, fragile intimacy. "There's a stream nearby," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "We can wash up before we move on." The stream was a ribbon of crystal-clear water tumbling over smooth stones. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt good to wash away the grime of the trail. They took turns, affording each other a measure of privacy, but they were still acutely aware of one another. As she was rinsing her face, he came to stand by the bank, holding out a clean cloth for her. He looked at her, really looked at her. In the clean morning light, her face was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down. Her hair, damp from the stream, curled around her face. She looked tired and worn, but there was a strength in her eyes he had not seen before. "Annabeth Hale," he said, the sound of her full name spoken aloud for the first time. It felt right. He was no longer seeing a runaway bride or a victim. He was seeing the woman herself, whole and unbroken despite everything. She looked up at him, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. Elias Rourke. While they found their fragile peace, Sheriff Brody was nursing his fury. Back in Blackwater Creek, his humiliation had festered into a cold, hard rage. The girl had not only defied him, she had made a fool of him. He would not stand for it. He went to the telegraph office and sent messages to every lawman and bounty agent in the territory. Then he nailed a poster to the town's notice board, right next to the general store. It had her name on it, a crude sketch of her face, and a description that painted her as a demon. Runaway bride, dangerous, wanted for arson. A bounty of $100 was offered for her capture. He was no longer looking for his wife. He was hunting a fugitive. 4 days later, Elias and Annabeth were running low on food. They cautiously made their way down to a remote trading post, a solitary building that catered to trappers and prospectors. While Annabeth waited with Gideon in a thicket of aspen trees, Elias went inside. He was trading for flour and bacon when he saw the poster nailed to the wall. His blood ran cold. He finished his business quickly, his hand never far from the butt of the revolver tucked into his belt. As he was leaving, a man stepped out of the shadows of the porch. He was tall and lean, with a cruel, thin mouth and the dead eyes of a vulture. "That's a heavy price for a runaway woman," the man said, gesturing with his chin toward a copy of the bounty poster tacked to the porch post. "You seen anyone like that up in the hills, friend?" "Can't say that I have," Elias said, his voice level. He started to walk toward the trees. The man fell into step beside him. "Funny thing, saw a woman with hair that color of corn silk waiting up yonder. Looked mighty scared. A man could do well for himself with $100? Elias stopped. "That's my wife," he said, the lie tasting like rust. "She's shy of strangers." The bounty hunter smiled, a humorless baring of teeth. "Is that so?" He moved suddenly, his hand flashing out, not for a gun, but for the knife sheathed at his belt. Elias reacted on pure instinct, years of saloon brawls and back-alley fights taking over. He sidestepped the knife thrust, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting. The bounty hunter was strong, and they grappled in the dirt, a desperate, silent struggle of grunts and straining muscles. Elias would not draw his gun. He would not kill. He fought with his fists, with his elbows, with a savage intensity born of desperation. He took a glancing blow from the knife along his ribs, a searing line of fire. He ignored it, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling. Before the man could recover, Elias was on him, landing a hard right to the jaw that snapped the man's head back. The bounty hunter went limp. Elias stood over him, breathing heavily, the coppery scent of his own blood filling his nostrils. He did not wait to see if the man was dead or just unconscious. He turned and ran. He found Annabeth, her face white with terror, and pulled her onto the horse. "Go!" he yelled, slapping Gideon's rump. He followed on foot, running until his lungs burned and the world started to go gray at the edges. They found shelter deep in the woods, under a canopy of ancient pine trees. Annabeth helped him sit, his back against a tree trunk. "He cut you?" she said, her voice shaking as she saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "It's nothing," he grunted, but the pain was a hot, sharp thing in his side. "Let me see." She did not wait for his permission. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she gently tore his shirt open. The cut was long and deep, bleeding sluggishly. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. Then she took their canteen and washed the blood away as best she could. As the shirt fell open, she saw them, the old scars, a puckered circle on his shoulder where a bullet had gone in, a long, thin white line that ran across his collarbone, a series of smaller, faded marks that looked like they had been made by a whip. They were a map of a violent life, a history written on his skin. "How many?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of an old scar on his abdomen. "How many men have you killed?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the trees. His jaw was tight. "Enough to lose count," he said, his voice flat and empty. She looked at his face, at the pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with the fresh wound in his side. He was not boasting. It was a confession, a statement of a truth so heavy it had shaped the course of his entire life. She saw the man he was, and the man he had been, and the man he was fighting so hard not to be again, and in that moment, her heart broke for him. She leaned forward, her hands coming up to cup his face, turning him toward her. She looked into his eyes, and then she kissed him. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss from the cabin. This was slow and deep and full of a tenderness that spoke of acceptance and understanding. She was not kissing a killer or a savior. She was kissing Elias. He responded, his hand coming up to tangle in her hair, pulling her closer. The pain, the fear, the past, it all fell away. There was only this connection, this moment of grace found in the heart of a merciless wilderness. He laid her down gently on a bed of soft pine needles as a light rain began to fall, pattering softly on the leaves above them. The rain was not a storm, but a soft, steady cleansing. They came together not in desperation, but in a kind of reverence, two scarred and broken souls finding a place of healing in each other's arms. Afterward, she lay curled against his side, listening to the rain and the steady rhythm of his breathing. A tear slipped from her eye, tracing a path down her temple. He felt it and shifted to look at her.
"You make me feel like I'm not ruined,"
she whispered, the words thick with emotion. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer. He kissed her forehead. "Annabeth," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "you're the bravest thing I've ever seen." Their peace, however, was bought on borrowed time. At the trading post, the bounty hunter had woken with a broken jaw and a burning need for vengeance. He had stumbled to the telegraph office. A short message clicked its way across the wires to Blackwater Creek, giving a direction and a description. Sheriff Brody read the telegram, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He saddled his horse, and he deputized two hard men who were more interested in the bounty than in the law. He headed into the hills, no longer just a sheriff in pursuit of a fugitive, but a hunter closing in for the kill. Elias felt it before he heard it, a change in the wind, a stillness in the woods that was unnatural. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He sat up, listening. It was a faint sound, carried on the breeze, the clink of a horseshoe on rock. It was distant, but it was coming their way. They had been found. He stood up and pulled on his torn shirt, the pain in his side a dull, constant throb. He looked at Annabeth, her face turned up to his, full of trust and fear. He walked over to his saddlebags and pulled out his revolver. The Colt felt heavy and cold and horribly familiar in his hand. He broke it open, checking the load with a practiced, steady hand. 6 bullets, 6 chances. He snapped it shut, the click echoing in the sudden silence of the forest. His vow was a ghost, a whisper of a man he could no longer afford to be. They rode west for a week, pushing Gideon to the limits of his endurance, leaving the high country behind and descending into the labyrinthine canyons of the Badlands. The world turned from green to 100 shades of red and brown. The air was dry, the sun a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. They were heading for a town called Redemption, a name Elias knew to be a liar's promise. It was a hardscrabble settlement carved into the side of a canyon, a stopover for prospectors, outlaws, and those hoping to catch a wagon train west before their luck or their money ran out. It was their last, best hope. Redemption was a town that clung to the rock, a single dusty street of false-fronted buildings baking in the sun. There was a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a hotel that looked more like a barracks. The eyes that watched them as they rode in were flat and suspicious. This was not a place that welcomed strangers. It was a place that stripped them of their secrets and their coin. Elias felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the instinct to walk with his back to the wall. He took a room for them at the hotel, paying for a week in advance with the last of his carefully hoarded money. The room was small and airless, with a lumpy mattress and a single window that looked out onto a dirty alley. But it was a lockable door, a roof over their heads. Annabeth stood by the window, her hand resting on the warped frame, looking not at the town, but at the sliver of open sky visible between the buildings. While she rested, Elias went to the saloon. It was the heart of the town, the place where information flowed as freely as the cheap whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. He ordered a drink he did not want and listened. His ears sifted through the drunken boasts and weary complaints until he heard what he was looking for. A man was organizing a wagon train, leaving for Oregon in 5 days' time. The price for passage was steep, more than he had, but it was a chance, a way out. Annabeth, left to the confines of the room, found the courage to venture out for a few necessities. The town was even more intimidating up close. Men stared at her, their gazes lingering on her worn dress and the lingering bruises on her face. In the general store, the proprietor treated her with a cold disdain, as if her poverty were an insult. As she was leaving, a group of women emerged from the saloon next door. They were painted and plumed, their laughter loud and brittle. One of them, a woman with tired, kind eyes and fiery red hair, saw the look on Annabeth's face, the way she clutched her small parcel to her chest. The woman gave her a small, conspiratorial nod, a flicker of understanding that passed between two women who knew the judgment of the world. Annabeth hurried back to the hotel, her heart pounding, feeling more alone than ever. That night, Elias told her about the wagon train. He laid out the plan, his voice low and practical. He would find work, do whatever it took to earn the money for her passage.
My passage?
She repeated, her brow furrowed.
What about yours?
He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. I am not going. Annabeth, they are looking for you, but it is my name on that new poster. I am the one they want now. If I am with you, they will never stop hunting. You go alone. You get to Oregon. You find a good town. You start over. You can be whoever you want to be. He was offering her freedom, a clean slate. He was also offering to cut her loose, to send her out into the world alone while he turned to face the ghosts that were chasing him. She stared at him, her blue eyes dark with an emotion he could not read. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. I will not. I am not leaving you. You have to, he insisted, his voice rising with a frustration born of fear for her. It is the only way. The only way for what? For you to go back to that cabin and wait for Brody to find you? For you to face him alone? She took a step closer, her hands clenched at her sides. I have been alone my entire life. Elias, I was alone when my brother was killed. I was alone when my father gave me away. I was alone in that church full of people who called themselves my neighbors. She looked him straight in the eye. I am not alone anymore. I'll go where you go, even if it is back to that cabin to die. I will not leave you. Her words struck him silent. He saw the fierce, unyielding loyalty in her eyes, and it both terrified and humbled him. She was tying her fate to his, a man with a past that was bound to get them both killed. He had no right to accept such a sacrifice, but he also knew, with a certainty that ached in his soul, that he did not have the strength to refuse it. Their days in redemption fell into a tense routine. Elias found work mucking out the blacksmith's stable. Hard, foul labor that paid little but kept him busy. Annabeth stayed in the room, a prisoner of their circumstance. On the third night, the stifling heat of the room became too much to bear. She slipped out, seeking a breath of cooler night air. She was standing in the shadows of the hotel porch when a man stumbled out of the saloon. He was thick-set and wore the clothes of a rancher. He squinted in the darkness, and his eyes fell on her. A slow, ugly recognition dawned on his face. Well, I'll be, he slurred, his voice thick with drink. Annabeth Hale, the little church burner from Blackwater Creek. Sheriff Brody's been looking all over for you. It was Caleb, a man who owned the ranch bordering her father's old property. Annabeth's blood ran cold. She turned to go back inside, but he was too quick. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. Where you going in such a hurry? We got a lot to talk about. There's $100 bounty on your head. Girl.
Let go of me,
she said, her voice a choked whisper. He laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound.
I don't think so. I think you and me are going to go see the marshal.
He started to drag her off the porch, his foul breath hot on her face.
But first, maybe you can show me what got the preacher's son so worked up.
His intent was clear. She struggled, twisting in his grip, but he was too strong. She opened her mouth to scream, but a door creaked open behind them.
Take your hands off her.
Elias's voice was unnaturally calm, but it held a deadly quiet that cut through the night. Caleb turned, sneering. Rourke, so the rumors are true. You're the one who snatched her. He shoved Annabeth behind him. This ain't your concern. I'm taking her in.
I said,
Elias repeated, taking a slow step forward. Let her go. Caleb released Annabeth and lunged at Elias, his fists swinging wildly. Elias moved with a fluid grace that was terrifying to watch. He sidestepped the clumsy punch, grabbed Caleb's outstretched arm, and twisted. There was a sickening crack, a sound of bone splintering, followed by a high-pitched scream of agony from Caleb. He collapsed to his knees, cradling his shattered arm, his face a mask of white-hot pain. The town marshal, a stout, balding man named Flint, with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, appeared as if from nowhere. He took in the scene, Annabeth, pale and trembling, Caleb, whimpering on the ground, and Elias standing over him, his face hard and unreadable. What's all this, then? The marshal demanded. He attacked me, Elias said flatly. I defended myself.
He tried to...
Annabeth started, her voice breaking. The marshal held up a hand, silencing them both. He did not care about the truth. He cared about the disruption. Assaulting a man in my town. Rourke, that's gonna cost you. He pulled his revolver. You're under arrest. They locked him in a small, foul-smelling cell at the back of the marshal's office. Annabeth pleaded with the marshal, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush, telling him what Caleb had done, what he had tried to do. Marshal Flint listened with a look of profound boredom. Ma'am, all I see is one man with a broken arm and another man who broke it. The law is simple on that point. Bail is $20. He can pay it, or he can sit in there until the circuit judge comes through next month.
$20. It was an impossible sum, more than the price of passage to Oregon. Desperate.
Annabeth reached up and unclasped the thin silver chain from around her neck. On it hung a small, intricately carved locket.
Please,
she said, holding it out to him.
This was my mother's. It is all I have. It must be worth something.
The marshal took the locket, weighed it in his palm with a practiced, dismissive air. It's pretty, but it ain't $20. He tossed it back on the desk. Come back when you have cash. Annabeth stumbled out into the night, her hope in ashes. The locket was her last link to a life before the debt, before Brody, before the fire, and it was not enough. She did not know where to go, what to do. She found herself standing in front of the Painted Lady Saloon, the sound of tinny piano music and rough laughter spilling out into the street. The door swung open, and the red-haired woman she had seen before stepped out. It was Maeve, the madam who ran the place. She saw the tears streaming down Annabeth's face.
Trouble, honey?
She asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. Annabeth told her everything. Maeve listened, her expression hardening. When Annabeth was finished, Maeve sighed, a long, weary sound. Men like that rancher and that marshal, this town is full of them. Come with me. She led Annabeth back to the marshal's office. Maeve slapped a stack of coins on the desk. The sound loud in the quiet room. $20, she said, her voice sharp. For the man in the cell. Marshal Flint looked at the money, then at Maeve, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He shrugged, scooped up the coins, and went to unlock the cell. Elias stepped out, his gaze finding Annabeth's immediately. As they turned to leave, Maeve put a hand on Annabeth's arm. She looked from Annabeth's tear-streaked face to Elias's grim one. "He better not waste your devotion, child," she said, her words a quiet warning. "There are not many second chances in a world like this." They did not go back to the hotel. They collected Gideon and their meager belongings and slipped out of town under the cover of darkness. As they passed the marshal's office, Elias saw a new poster being nailed to the board, illuminated by the light from the office window. It was a crude sketch of his own face. The words beneath it were stark. Elias Rourke, kidnapper, armed and dangerous. They found refuge in a deserted barn a few miles out of town. The air was close, smelling of old hay and decay. The weight of what had happened, of what was happening, finally settled on them. They were no longer just running. They were being hunted together. "This is my fault," Annabeth said. Her voice choked with guilt as she sank down onto a pile of hay. "If I had just stayed in the room." "It is not your fault," Elias said, his voice raw. He paced the length of the barn, a caged animal. This was always going to happen. Brody was never going to stop. He finally stopped pacing and turned to her, his face a mask of anguish. "I cannot protect you. Annabeth, everything I do to keep you safe just makes it worse. I break a man's arm, and they call me an attacker. I shelter you, and they call me a kidnapper." He ran a hand through his hair, his control finally cracking. "I am losing myself trying to keep you alive. The man I swore I would never be again. He is always there, right under the surface, and I am getting tired of fighting him." He was losing his soul, the quiet, hard-won peace he had built for himself. He was losing it for her. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the barn wall. "You are the only reason I am alive," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "Do you not see that? Without you, I would be dead, or worse. You talk of losing your soul. I did not even have one left until I met you." She got to her feet and walked toward him, her steps unsteady but sure. She stopped in front of him, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her. She reached up and placed her hands on his chest. "If you must lose it," she whispered, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction, "then lose it for me, Elias." Her words shattered the last of his resistance. He looked down into her upturned face, and he saw not a burden, but his reason for breathing. He saw the woman who had faced down a murderer, who had run through fire, who had offered up her last treasured possession for him. He groaned, a sound of utter surrender, and crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was not tender. It was hard, desperate, a collision of two people at the end of their rope. It was a kiss of rage and fear, and a love so powerful it threatened to consume them both. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her impossibly closer, while hers clutched at his shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. They collapsed together into the hay, two outlaws, two fugitives, two lovers finding their only solace in the storm. The next morning, Elias woke to a sound he had never heard before. Annabeth was humming. She was sitting up, her back to him, trying to stitch a tear in his shirt with a piece of thread she had unraveled from her petticoat. The early morning sun streamed through a gap in the roof, illuminating her in a halo of golden light. Her face, for the first time since he had met her, looked peaceful. A small, genuine smile played on her lips as she worked. She looked happy. He lay there, watching her, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest. For a single, perfect moment, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe they could make it. Maybe there was a place for them somewhere, a place where the past could not find them. The moment was fleeting. He heard a sound from the direction of the town, the distant but distinct sound of multiple horses, moving at a steady pace. He sat up, his body instantly alert. He crept to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. In the distance, on the road leading from Redemption, he saw them. 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the rising sun. They were too far away to make out their faces. But he did not need to. He knew who they were. Sheriff Brody's men had arrived. The hunt had begun again. The world dissolved into a blur of frantic motion. Elias grabbed Annabeth's hand, pulling her from the relative safety of the barn into the harsh morning light. "They're here," he said. The 2 words a death sentence for the brief peace they had found. He threw her onto Gideon's back, their saddlebags already secured, and swung up behind her, digging his heels into the horse's flanks. They did not ride on the road, but plunged into the tangled woods. Thorns and branches tearing at their clothes, the sounds of pursuit, a distant but steady drumbeat behind them. He pushed them relentlessly, his knowledge of the wild country their only advantage. He was heading for a place he had not seen in 20 years, a ghost from his own past. It was an abandoned silver mine, a black wound in the side of a granite cliff, a place where a scared and lonely boy had once hidden from the world. He hoped the mountain remembered him. He hoped it would hide them now. They found it late that afternoon, a dark slash in the rock face, partially obscured by a fall of scree and a thicket of stubborn pines. The entrance was small, a place a rider might easily miss if he did not know exactly where to look. Elias dismounted, leading Gideon into the narrow opening. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and a deep, metallic stillness. It was a tomb, but it was safe, for now. Their new life was one of shadows and echoes. They lived in the chill of the earth, the darkness a constant companion, broken only by the small, sputtering fires Elias dared to build. Their supplies dwindled with alarming speed. They rationed the last of the flour and bacon, their meals becoming meager affairs eaten in a silence that was heavy with fear. They slept on the cold stone floor, huddled together for warmth under a single, threadbare blanket. The hardship stripped away everything but the essential. In the dark, she stitched his torn shirt with a needle he kept for mending tack, her small, patient movements a quiet rebellion against the chaos that surrounded them. Her presence was a small, steady flame in the crushing darkness of the mine. One night, as the fire burned low, he found himself telling her about the boy who had hidden here before. "This was my place," he said, his voice a low echo in the cavern. "After my father," he trailed off, the memory still a raw, unhealed wound. The past came for him then, not as a memory, but as if it were happening all over again. He was 10 years old. His mother had been gone a year, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley, leaving a silence in their small cabin that was louder than any storm. He remembered her hands, always smelling of flower and wildflowers. He remembered her singing. After she was gone, the singing stopped forever. His father became a hard, silent man. His grief a wall Elias could not penetrate. He was a good man, a fair man, but the light had gone out of his eyes. He had a dispute with a neighboring rancher over a water right. It was a stupid argument, born of pride in a dry season. One day, his father rode out to meet the man, to settle it once and for all. He never came back. The neighbor's ranch hands brought him home, slung over his own saddle, a single, neat hole in his chest. They called it a fair fight. Elias knew it was an execution. He had looked into the neighbor's eyes at the funeral and seen no remorse, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had gotten what he wanted. That night, Elias took his father's rifle, a piece of bread, and ran. He ran to this mine and stayed for a week, a feral child raised on grief and a burning, helpless rage. "They told me I was an orphan," he said to Annabeth, his voice rough with an emotion he had buried for 2 decades, "that the church would find a place for me. I just remember feeling empty, like someone had scooped out my insides." He looked at her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, and saw the deep, compassionate sorrow in her eyes. He felt a sudden, desperate need to give her all of it, every last broken piece of himself. "I wanted to be a preacher once," he admitted, the words feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "Before all that, I used to listen to the circuit preacher, and I thought there was no finer thing than to speak of God's grace, of forgiveness, He gave a short, bitter laugh. The West had other plans. It beat the grace right out of me. It taught me that a fast gun was a better savior than a prayer. She did not speak. She simply reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. It was an anchor, a silent promise that he was no longer that lonely boy hiding in the dark. "I wanted to be a painter," she said softly. Her confession a gift offered in return for his. My mother taught me. We did not have much, but she would find pigments in the earth, in berries, in clay. She would show me how to see the world, not just as it was, in all its hardship, but as it could be, all the colors of it. Annabeth looked at the rough stone wall of the cave. I used to dream of having real canvases, of painting landscapes so real you could feel the wind in the trees. The next day, Elias found her by a section of smooth rock near the back of the cave. She had a piece of charcoal from the fire, and she was drawing. Her hand moved with a surprising confidence, sketching the shape of a horse, its head thrown back, its mane a wild tangle. It was Gideon, but it was more than Gideon. It was the idea of him, the spirit of him, captured in a few stark, black lines. It was a thing of beauty in a place of utter desolation. He stood in the shadows, watching her. He watched as she added the sweeping line of a mountain range behind the horse, the jagged peaks reaching for a sky that was not there. She was not just sketching, she was creating a world where a horse could run free, where the mountains were a promise of majesty, not a prison. He looked at her, at the intense focus on her face, at the charcoal smudged on her cheek, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed a dangerous seed of hope to take root in his heart. He saw a future, a life beyond the running. He saw a small ranch, somewhere far away, maybe in Oregon. He saw her, with a real canvas, with real paints, painting the colors of a world they had built together. He saw a life where his hands were used for building, not breaking, and where her hands were used for creating, not just surviving. The hope was a fragile, beautiful thing, and it was shattered 2 days later. He had climbed to a high ridge above the mine to scout, to see if the trail they had left had been discovered. He lay flat on his belly, peering through a screen of juniper bushes, and then he saw them. 3 riders, moving slowly, methodically, sweeping the area. It was Sheriff Brody and his 2 deputies. They had not given up. They had tracked them this far. It was only a matter of time before they found the mine. A cold, calm certainty settled over him. This was the end of the line. There was nowhere left to run. He looked back toward the dark opening of the mine where Annabeth was waiting, sketching her charcoal dreams on a stone wall. He would not let them find her. He would not let Brody put his hands on her ever again. He crept back down to the mine, his movements silent. She was asleep, curled up under the blanket, her face soft and unguarded in the dim light. His heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a silent goodbye. Then he stood up, grabbed his rifle, and checked the load. He slung his cartridge belt over his shoulder. He took one last look at her, memorizing the line of her cheek, the way her hair fell across the blanket. Then he slipped out of the mine, into the cold, gray afternoon. He moved through the rocks and trees, a ghost in his own land. He circled around behind Brody's position, climbing to a rocky outcropping that overlooked a narrow gorge. This would be the place. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, took a deep breath, and fired a shot into the rock face a few feet to the left of the deputies. The shot echoed through the canyons. The men below reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, their heads swiveling to find the source. Elias fired again, this time kicking up dirt near Brody's horse. He had their attention. "He's up there!" one of the deputies yelled, pointing toward Elias's position. Brody's face was a mask of cold fury. "Spread out! We'll flush him out!" Elias did not wait. He scrambled back from the ledge and began to run, deliberately making noise, leading them away from the mine, drawing them toward the gorge. He could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind him. their shouts echoing in the still air. He ran until his lungs burned, until the wound in his side, not yet fully healed, screamed in protest. He reached the entrance to the gorge and plunged into the narrow passage, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. He found his position, a small alcove hidden behind a cluster of boulders. He waited, his heart pounding, the rifle cool and steady in his hands. The first deputy entered the gorge, moving cautiously, his pistol drawn. Elias had him in his sights. He could end it, but his vow, the ghost of the man he wanted to be, held him back. He fired a warning shot into the wall beside the man's head, showering him with rock fragments. The deputy cried out and scrambled back. But they were not deterred. Brody was a relentless hunter. They began to advance, using the rocks for cover, firing blindly into his position. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head, stinging his cheek with stone chips. He was pinned down. He knew he could not hold them off forever. Then he saw Brody, moving along the rim of the gorge, trying to get a clear shot from above. It was a trap. Elias had to move. He broke from his cover, running deeper into the gorge. A searing white-hot pain exploded in his side, stealing his breath and sending him stumbling to his knees. He had been hit. He looked down and saw the dark blood blossoming on his shirt. Through the haze of pain, he saw the second deputy emerge from behind a rock, not 20 yards away, his rifle leveled, his face a grim mask of triumph. There was no time for a warning, no time for a vow. There was only Annabeth's face, sleeping peacefully in the dark. Elias raised his own rifle, the movement fluid, instinctive, a muscle memory from a life he had tried to bury. He fired. The deputy was thrown backward, his rifle clattering on the stones. He did not get up. The sound of the final, fatal shot was still ringing in his ears when the sky broke. A cold, sudden rain began to fall. Back in the cave, Annabeth woke to the distant crack of gunfire. She sat bolt upright, her heart seizing with a terror so profound it stole her breath. Elias. She scrambled to the mouth of the cave. His rifle was gone. He was gone. The sound of another shot, closer this time, echoed from the direction of the gorge. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She ran out into the sudden downpour, her bare feet slipping on the wet stones, the cold mud sucking at her ankles. She ran toward the sound of the guns, toward the man she loved, the promise of Oregon, the dream of a peaceful life. It was all smoke. The only thing that was real was Elias, and he was in trouble. She found him at the end of the gorge, collapsed against a blood-streaked boulder. He was pale, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. The front of his shirt was soaked with blood, a dark, terrible stain that was being diluted by the falling rain. "Elias!" she screamed, falling to her knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, trying to focus on her. "Annabeth, run!" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Brody." "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. She hooked her arms under his, trying to lift him. He was a dead weight, his body limp with pain and blood loss. She summoned a strength she did not know she possessed, a strength born of pure, desperate love. She half dragged, half carried him, stumbling backward out of the gorge, her bare feet cut and bleeding on the sharp rocks. The rain fell harder, plastering her hair to her face, mingling with the tears that streamed down her cheeks. She got him back to the mine, a journey that felt like 100 miles, and gently lowered him to the stone floor. He was shivering violently, his skin clammy and cold. She tore a wide strip from the hem of her last good dress, the one he had bought her, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound in his side. She held it there, her hands shaking, as she watched the life draining out of him. She built up the fire until it was roaring, trying to fight back the chill that was consuming him. She wrapped him in their only blanket, but still he shivered. She lay down beside him on the cold stone, wrapping her own body around his, trying to give him her warmth, her life. She held him all through the long, dark night, whispering his name over and over. A prayer, a plea, a promise. "Elias, stay with me! Elias, please, stay with me!" At dawn, the rain was still falling, a soft, steady weeping from a gray sky. He was still breathing, but just barely. His life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Annabeth knelt beside him, her face pale and haggard, her hope worn down to a single, raw nerve. She closed her eyes and folded her hands, the charcoal from her drawing still smudged on her fingers. She began to pray aloud, her voice a hoarse whisper in the stillness of the cave. She did not pray for their escape. She did not pray for her own safety. She prayed for him. "God, if you are there," she whispered, her words swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the stone. "Do not let him die. Take me, take anything, but let him live. Please, just let him live." He did not die. He clung to life with a stubbornness that was as much a part of him as the scars on his skin. Annabeth's prayer, whispered into the cold stone, was answered not with a miracle, but with the grueling, merciless work of survival. For 3 days, a fever raged through him, leaving him delirious, his words a broken jumble of forgotten names and violent memories. Annabeth did not leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water from the stream, forced sips of water between his cracked lips, and held his hand when the shaking became too much to bear. She remembered things her mother had taught her, fragments of folk wisdom that now became her gospel. She ventured out from the mine, a desperate forager, her eyes scanning the forest floor. She found willow bark, chewing it herself before giving him the pulp to fight the fever. She found the feathery leaves of yarrow and made a poultice to pack into his wound, praying it would stop the bleeding from starting anew. But it was not enough. The wound was deep, and an angry red color began to spread around its edges. It was infected. Without real medicine, the fever would win. The thought of him dying, of her prayer being for nothing, was an agony she could not endure. She made a decision born of pure desperation. She would go to redemption. She waited until the dead of night, pulling the hood of his wool coat deep over her face. She left him sleeping, his breathing still shallow, and slipped out of the mine. The journey to the town was a long walk through a terrifying darkness, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sending a jolt of fear through her. She avoided the main road, sticking to the shadows, a ghost moving through a hostile world. Redemption was asleep, save for the faint light spilling from the saloon. She crept through the alleyways, her destination the small office of the town doctor. The door was locked. She peered through the window and saw it. On a shelf, bottles of carbolic acid and laudanum. She found a loose rock and, with a heart that hammered against her ribs, she broke the window pane. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent town. She reached through, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grasp the bottles. She took what she needed, wrapped them in a cloth, and ran. She was halfway down the alley when a door opened, spilling a rectangle of lamplight onto the dirt. An older woman stood there, holding a lantern. She was stout, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were not unkind. "Running from something, child?" the woman asked, her voice calm. Annabeth froze, trapped in the light, the stolen medicine clutched to her chest. She could not speak. The woman raised the lantern, her gaze taking in Annabeth's ragged dress, her bare, scratched feet, the terror in her eyes. She was the widow who lived next to the doctor's office. "You are the one they were looking for, the one with the man who broke Caleb's arm." Annabeth could only nod, tears of fear and exhaustion streaming down her face. She expected the woman to scream, to call for the marshal. Instead, the widow's expression softened with a look of profound, weary pity. "He is hurt bad, is he not?" she asked gently. Annabeth nodded again. The widow sighed. "Come inside. Just for a moment. She led Annabeth into a small, immaculately clean kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. She took the bottles from Annabeth's trembling hands and wrapped them properly in a clean cloth, adding a small tin of salve and a roll of fresh bandages. "The doctor is a drunk and a cheat. He will not miss these." The woman, whose name was Martha, pressed a small pouch into Annabeth's hand. It held a piece of bread and some dried meat. "You love him, do you not?"
"More than my own life,"
Annabeth whispered. Martha looked at her, and in her eyes Annabeth saw a deep well of shared sorrow, the universal understanding of a woman who had seen the cruelty of men. "Blackwater Creek is a town of whispers and hard hearts. Child, I grew up not 10 miles from there. You are not the first girl they tried to ruin with their judgment and their lies." She paused, her gaze holding Annabeth's. "You are just the one who ran." Annabeth left the town with more than just medicine. She left with a flicker of hope, a small tear in the suffocating blanket of condemnation that had smothered her for so long. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl back toward the light. The medicine and Annabeth's relentless care fought back the infection. The fever broke. One afternoon, Elias opened his eyes, and they were clear. He looked at her, truly saw her, pale and exhausted, sitting by his side. "Annabeth," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. He tried to sit up, but the effort left him weak and gasping. "Be still," she commanded softly, pushing him gently back down. He healed slowly. His body, though strong, had been pushed to its limit. He was weak, dependent on her for everything. He watched her as she changed his bandages, as she made him broth from a rabbit she had managed to snare, as she sat sketching on the cave wall while he slept. The guilt was a heavy weight on his conscience. He had brought this upon her. He had chained her to a dying man. "You have to go," he told her one evening, his voice gaining some of its old strength. "I am only holding you back. Take Gideon, ride west. Do not stop." She stopped her work and looked at him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "We have had this conversation before. Elias," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "The answer is still no." "This is different," he insisted. "I am a wanted man. I killed a deputy. There is no going back from that. They will hang me if they find me. You can still be free." "What is freedom?" she asked, her voice laced with a pain that went deeper than their current predicament. "A life spent looking over my shoulder? A life without you?" She shook her head, a final, resolute gesture. "My place is here. I am not leaving you, so you must get well. You must get strong enough for both of us." A week later, Martha came. She had tracked them, a silent accomplice in their survival. She brought food, a new blanket, and news. The words spilled out of her in a hushed, urgent torrent. Sheriff Brody was dead. His remaining deputy, a man named Peters, had shot him. The story, as it was told in Redemption, was that the two had been drinking heavily in the saloon, arguing over the bounty money for Annabeth. The argument had escalated. Peters, in a drunken rage, had accused Brody of wanting the girl for himself, not for justice. Brody had gone for his gun. Peters had been faster. Elias listened, his face a stony mask. Brody had not died in a blaze of glory, not in a righteous gunfight. He had died in a squalid, drunken brawl over his own greed and obsession. It was a pathetic end for a man who had caused so much pain. With Brody dead, the hunt was over. There was no one left who cared enough to chase them. They were, for the first time, truly free. A few days later, Elias was strong enough to stand, to walk. He was thin, and his face was drawn with pain, but he was alive. They emerged from the mine, blinking in the bright sunlight like creatures born of the dark. They walked out of the mountains and back toward the world. They did not head west, not yet. They headed back to Blackwater Creek. They walked into town hand in hand. It was midday, and the street was busy. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. A silence fell over the town, a silence thick with shock and judgment. The townsfolk stared at them. Some whispered behind their hands. Some looked away, their faces full of shame or fear. Annabeth walked with her head held high. She was wearing what was left of her wedding dress. It was no longer a symbol of her humiliation, but a tattered banner of her survival. She let them see it all. The scorched lace, the muddy hem, the tear where she had ripped a strip away to bind his wound. She let them see the burns on her skin and the scars on her heart that were reflected in her clear, unwavering eyes. She was not hiding anymore. Reverend Miller stepped out of the church, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. He strode toward them, his black coat flapping like the wings of a crow. He pointed a trembling finger at Annabeth. "Harlot!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent street. "You dare to show your face here, you who defiled the house of God, who ran from your sacred vows, who laid with this killer in the wilderness. You are a vessel of sin and shame." Annabeth stopped. She looked at the preacher, at his face, contorted with a hatred that had nothing to do with God. And she felt nothing, no fear, no shame, only a vast, calm pity. She spoke, and her voice, though quiet, carried with a strength that silenced him. "I am not his bride," she said, her gaze steady. "I am not his shame." That was all. She turned her back on him and, with Elias at her side, walked to the marshal's office. There, in a makeshift court with the town's new, nervous marshal and a handful of elders, Elias testified. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as he told them of Sheriff Brody's crimes, the murder of Thomas Hale, the blackmail of a grieving father, the relentless, obsessive hunt for a woman who had dared to speak the truth. He told them of the bounty hunter, of the fight in the gorge. He left nothing out. He laid the truth bare for the town to see. When he was done, a heavy silence filled the room. The town had been complicit in its silence, in its willingness to believe the powerful over the powerless. The court, eager to put the sordid affair behind them, officially cleared both of them of all wrongdoing, but the acceptance of the law was not the acceptance of the heart. As they left the office, the stares that followed them were no longer just curious. They were cold. They were free. But they would never be welcome here. This place would forever be a graveyard of bad memories. They left that same afternoon, riding west on Gideon, the open sky a vast, blue promise above them. They did not look back. They rode until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. As evening settled, a familiar patter began, a soft, gentle rain falling from a darkening sky. It was not a storm, but a cleansing. Annabeth leaned back against Elias's chest, the steady rhythm of his heart a comfort against her back. She tilted her head up to look at him, a slow, real smile spreading across her face. The rain mingled with the happy tears in her eyes. "Break your promise again," she whispered, her voice full of a love that was as deep and as sure as the mountains they had left behind. Elias looked down at her, at this woman of impossible courage and strength, and his heart felt so full he thought it might break. He lowered his head, his lips finding hers. He pulled her close, her torn dress soaked, her body warm against his. And there, in the saddle, under the gentle, falling rain, two broken souls, finally finding their way home, sealed their future with a kiss. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.